College football nerds, talking LSU, talking college football. Josh is with me. We're getting nerdy with y'all. You know the deal. Me, Josh, we talk numbers, we talk data, but we don't have the data yet. So we're going to just talk we can at a high level. I've got a green shirt on that's super wrinkled. It's not as tight as Josh Pate's. So I'm sure he'll give me hell for that. But if it were tight, you wouldn't see all the wrinkles. So anyway, Josh of College Football Nerds, let's talk a little bit about LSU. I think there's a lot of discussion and everybody's ready to just say they're going to suck. And they're losing this and this and this and this. And we'll talk about the losses here in a minute on the personnel side and on the coaching side. But a theme that keeps coming back to my head, and I want you to talk about it a little bit, is are we making the mistake of assuming that unknown is bad? Because I think that's what we're doing, especially with Myles Brennan. We're doing that a lot. Unknown is bad. As if him not starting over Joe Burrow means he's just a terrible quarterback. There's a handful of programs, maybe 4 or 5, that if Joe Burrow transferred there, he wouldn't have started over their quarterback. And that's not to say there were 4 or 5 better quarterbacks last year. Let's just say if there's an incumbent guy that's one of the top quarterbacks in the country, you're not going to start over him. So to say that Myles Brennan is bad because he didn't start over Joe Burrow is a little bit of a concern for me if you're going to be realistic. But just talk about that for a little bit. Where are we making the mistake of thinking, okay, we've got a lot of new faces, it's a lot of unknown, therefore I'm just going to assume that that's bad and they're going to suck?
Well, you didn't leave me a lot to discuss here, did you, Daniel? I mean, I think the reality is exactly what you said, right? The roster turnover was high, and 14 players that go in the NFL draft, that is the most, as far as I'm aware, of any team in college football coming off a championship. In fact, we dug into this. You're more than welcome to prove me wrong, but as far as I'm aware, no team coming off a championship season has ever had this many guys get drafted. And the reality of that doesn't necessarily mean that LSU is going to be bad. It just means they're going to be different. And is different bad? I think if your expectation is national title, then yeah, it's the odds of any team being a national title team are extremely slim. The reason teams don't repeat as champions, it's due to a lot of things. One, people talk about being able to be, you end up too complacent. It's hard to have that kind of drive. That's all true. 2, I think there's a major issue with the fact that you have to be at a very high level in terms of experience and seniority to win a championship. And if you're at that level, it's almost impossible to be at that level again the following year. And then 3, it's just really daggum unlikely for any given team to win a championship. So when you look at all those 3 things together, yeah, it's probably unrealistic to peg LSU as the national champion, just like it's unrealistic to peg anybody. Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. It's unlikely that any of the 3 actually do win a championship. They're maybe just more likely than others. But that isn't to say that LSU is necessarily going to be a bad team. It may be that LSU is a 1-loss team this season. It may be that LSU is a championship team. We just don't really know. It is, I think, fair to say there's more turnover than any team in recent memory. But I think you also have to be fair with the fact that just because there's more turnover and it's more of an unknown when you recruit at this level doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. And as we said a lot before the video, there actually are a pretty good number of pieces that played meaningful minutes, especially on the defensive side of the ball, but also on the offensive side of the ball. And those probably don't get as much credit as they should.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because everybody knows Chase is coming back, great wide receiver. They don't know or talk about Marshall coming back, which reminds me of what people are saying about Alabama. Like, oh, Devonta Smith's coming back. You've got that good receiver, but you lost these 2 other really good receivers who went first in the first round draft. Jalen Waddle, who was technically not a starter last year, is going to be the number 1 wide receiver drafted this year, guaranteed. And nobody's talking about that. And I think that's what we forget is we remember the pieces you lost, and we can pick out a couple of good ones that you got coming back because that's the ones we remember too. But it's sort of this confirmation bias where if our team didn't win the national championship, we want to pick apart the national champion but don't do the same thing for our team and our outgoing departures. We give the new guys on our team the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing with LSU right now is they're not giving them the benefit of the doubt because they want them to be bad, because they want to think their team has a chance. On the flip side, I have some concerns about who LSU is now or in week 2 versus Texas versus who they're going to be at the end of the season because of their youth. So my question to you is, how good, I guess, do the good and the bad on their schedule. Texas week 2, a lot of filler other than that Florida game on October 10th, and then just an absolutely brutal end to the schedule. This is what we talk about when everybody's like, the crappy FCS game right before their last game of the season. Well, this is what you get. You get Auburn instead of an FCS game, sandwiched in between South Carolina and Texas A&M. Not really fair. But talk about the good and the bad of that last bit of the stretch in terms of how it sets LSU up on the national picture.
Well, first, I can't let you go completely by guaranteeing Waddle to be the first receiver drafted. When
he will be. Write it down, book it. He's going to be the number 1 wide receiver off the board. I said Henry Ruggs last year in the middle of the season, and I got it right. Waddle, because of his punt return capability, kickoff return capability, he's just as good at that as he is wide receiver. He's going to be the number 1 if he stays healthy off the board, guaranteed. We can come back here.
Well, I think a lot of LSU fans are going to point to Jamar Chase, who did sort of win the Blitnikoff. But going into this season, I definitely think the turnover hurts more than normal in the COVID situation. And we talk about being able to rebuild. No one knows, again, is an unknown a bad thing? No one knows how teams are going to react. There was no spring practice. There is a longer than normal fall practice, which people seem to be completely glossing over, but you get a couple extra weeks effectively practice, as I understand it. I still think it's a bad thing overall if you have a lot of turnover. Texas was a team that was badly injured last year. The Texas that LSU played was absolutely not the Texas that played a few weeks later against, losing to TCU. Didn't resemble the same team. We've had a little graphic we did where we realized you could make actually probably a top 10 defense out of just the players that were injured on Texas and Alabama's defensive squad. You can find it on Twitter. It's fun. All 11 players are accounted for with multiple All-Americans. Those guys that were hurt are pretty much all back. And so LSU is going to be playing a Texas team that all has a bunch of guys that were kind of out for injury, and then the young guys had to play as spot starters. They're a more experienced than normal squad. Playing them in week 2 is not a good spot, and that's going to be a really hard game, even though I think LSU may be more talented top to bottom and probably are more talented top to bottom than Texas. The experience level is going to be tough in week 2. As you said, we both think Florida is going to be a lot better this year. I still think there's a talent gap with LSU. They have not caught that up. Even by midseason, it's going to be tough for Florida to win, but they did push LSU to the wire last year. The end of the season has a lot of good and bad. The bad is obvious. Playing Alabama, South Carolina, Auburn, A&M without a break, there's no bye week, there's no FCS team in between, is brutal. And it's you kind of feel like you're almost doomed to lose one of that group just because, playing Alabama and South Carolina may not be terribly good, but they're still going to be pretty physical. I mean, this is still going to be, maybe a Miss Champ coach team by the end of the year. And then you got to turn around and play Auburn that you're used to playing pretty early in the season, or at least by midway through the season. And now you're going to play them and then turn around and play A&M. And we've already seen how that plays out when you play A&M and you're beat up at the end of the year. There is a silver lining, though. The same way that you really didn't want to play Texas in week 2, especially given the team Texas will be as a more experienced team, you do want to play as many good teams as you can late. LSU is going to be a much better team at the end of the season than they will be at the early part of the season. At least they should be. There is a lot of turnover, but it should gel. LSU is a radically better team in November and December last year than they were in the first 2 months of the season last year. I think you're going to see the same thing happen. So while it is a brutal gauntlet, I think if LSU was playing Alabama or Auburn or A&M even at the very early part of the year, and a lot of people think A&M is going to be improved because of seniority, those games might have been more difficult just because you maybe were at a disadvantage in terms of experience. That's going to go away by the end of the season. And as much as the schedule's difficult, I think it benefits LSU because that experiential gap should start to diminish, if not entirely disappear by that point.
And let's talk about this hypothetical, because we hate hypotheticals and we never talk about them, but I want to talk about it. The way this shakes out with that backloaded schedule and the maturity of this team having, like you said, the potential for exponential growth throughout the year, I think it's possible for a 10-2 LSU team to be in the playoffs. And hear me out. Texas game doesn't matter for the SEC race. And the other early-ish game that they have that's hard that they could lose is Florida, who's in the East. So they could drop a game in the SEC. We always talk about how it's so hard to be in the West, where you might be in Alabama last year, who was basically out of the playoff hunt in the second they lost to LSU. You lose one game in your conference, you don't win your division. People are like, oh, you don't need to be in the playoffs because you didn't win your division. We didn't have that here. Like, LSU could legit lose to Texas and Florida and still be the representative for the West in the SEC championship game and play, a top 5 Georgia or Florida again. I don't see that as a scenario. Like, do you? Am I crazy? Like, a 10-2 team that in the SEC that won the SEC championship, that team's in the playoffs in most years, right?
You're probably looking at 3 top 10 wins, something like that, out of that team. I'm guessing Alabama's probably going to be top 10. Whoever you play in out of the East Championship is going to be a top 10 team. I'm guessing out of like Auburn, Texas A&M. I'm not even going to throw like Arkansas and Ole Miss. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. But one of those may be top 10. And that resume is going to challenge anybody else. If Texas is good enough to beat LSU, I think we both think that they're probably our favorite to win the Big 10 this year, or excuse me, the Big 12. So let's say Ohio State makes it, and let's say Clemson makes it, and let's say Texas makes it. Then you're just looking like LSU versus Oregon.
And Oregon would have probably lost to Ohio State already.
Right. Oregon plays Ohio State. So those teams, one of them has to have a loss. And even if it's a 1-loss Oregon versus a 2-loss LSU with that resume, if it's 1-loss Oregon and their losses to Ohio State, and let's say Texas makes it in, you got 2 champions that already lost to 2 other champions. LSU's resume is going to be a heck of a lot stronger than Oregon's. And people don't have confidence in the Pac-12. I think you'd have a real shot that LSU is going to get in over Oregon, even as a 1-loss Oregon, much less the fact that the Pac-12 has repeatedly not produced a 1-loss champion. They produced multi-loss champions. And heck, Clemson could lose a game, and if they lose a game, they're going to have nothing to show for it. So at the very least, it'd be an interesting debate. It would make every non-SEC fan mad, but in my mind, I think LSU would deserve to be in that situation.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about personnel because I think we're going to see some new names shine that would hopefully propel them into the conversation if they were 10-2. We thought that John Emery might be the guy last year. He was that good. We'd like to tape his high school film that much. Clyde Edwards-Helaire came out of nowhere, proved us to be wrong. We totally missed the boat on him. We'll own that. We were wrong on him. We didn't like what we saw last year or even early in the season. I mean, the year before or early in the season last year. We still like Emery a lot. We still like, obviously, Chase and Marshall a lot. We think Myles Brennan at least is going to be a serviceable quarterback. You were talking to me before we got into this. One, the Brooks thing is a big deal. But you had some concerns where there's a lot of probably comfort at the skill positions, and then the edges defensively. Everybody knows about Stingley. They got other guys returning their experience. You're concerned for LSU this year if they're going to be judged as a national title contender, are in the trenches. Talk about that for a little bit.
Right. And, like you said, the skill positions, I'll start off with a positive, I think are in pretty good shape. I mean, you mentioned Emery, but it's entirely possible that he's third string or worse behind guys like Curry, Davis Price. There's a tremendous amount of talent there. The secondary, you've got Stingley coming back. You've got Stevens. You've also got guys like Todd Harris and Curry Vincent that have played a lot of snaps. You've got Elias Ricks coming in as a freshman. The flashy positions are well equipped. Maybe a question mark at quarterback, but it's just a straight unknown. I feel like he hasn't played very many snaps. The concern for me is, one, the offensive line has not been great over the past 4 years. It was a good offensive line last year, but prior years it really hadn't been fantastic. It's definitely a bit of a reset this year, and I'm not sure, I'm just not sure where it's going to be. And then defensively, it was a good line last year that LSU had, and I'm not sure that it's going to quite resemble it. I mean, McClendon, maybe ends up being a good player. Shelvin played a lot of snaps. You still, like, you got guys like Shelvin or Glenn Logan that are good players. I don't know that they're disruptors. Logan's more than Shelvin, but like on the edges, maybe a guy like Ojolari comes on strong. He kind of looked like he might be the next option. I don't necessarily think the depth is there like it was last season. And I definitely think there's, to me, a lot of concern with guys like, when you lose guys like Jacob Phillips or you lose Chason, again, like, you touched on it, but Marcel Brooks, I think, was a big loss, because to me, he was the guy that seemed to be coming on and the replacement for Chason. Ojolari is more tabbed to be a defensive end. I don't know. One, I don't know that there's the disruption on defense or that there's the power and consistency on offense. Two, these guys that are all coming in that you say, yeah, but Shelvin did pretty well, Ika did, Logan did, they were reserve players last year. They were rotating in the lineup. They've got to be starters. I don't know that they're as good if they're as the guys they're replacing necessarily. And the depth is going to take a little bit of a hit. There's certainly a lot of recruiting, but you've got guys like Farrell and Anthony in the lineup, and I haven't felt like it's been splashy enough. I'll say one thing, and I'm curious if you agree with it. We mentioned in terms of a positive for Michigan, when you look at the NFL draft, their guys didn't go as high as you might have thought. I mean, Peoples-Jones was a 6th-round pick. Patterson goes undrafted. We kind of called that a long time ago. You have like Tariq Black transferring out, who was himself like a top 50 recruit. And partly because he was getting buried on the depth chart. LSU has a little bit of the opposite problem. So we talked about, everybody knows the unknown part, but the thing that's a little concerning to me with LSU is it's not so much how many they're losing, but it's where they were and how they all went as higher, I think, than anybody expected, especially early in the season. Chason, people didn't think he was going to be a first-round draft pick mid-year. They thought he was kind of having a disappointing year. No one on earth would have seen Patrick Queen being a first-round draft pick in the first couple months of the season. I was really high on Fulton, I thought, in terms of just actual where he was at day to day. Stingley may be a better pro prospect, but I felt like Fulton was actually a better corner for LSU last year. Everybody knows about Delpit. I'm just kind of shocked how many people went above them. Edwards-Helaire in the first round, Justin Jefferson kind of coming out of nowhere. Jacob Phillips goes in the 3rd round, right? Sadiq Charles goes in the 4th round. Rashard Lawrence goes in the 4th round. There's a lot of really good talent across the board from LSU that was lost, but a lot of it was, in terms of how the pros viewed them, I think valued a lot more and a lot higher than was expected. Not only did they lose so many NFL draft picks, they lost a lot of high picks, and they lost them higher than expected. And I'm kind of curious what your viewpoint is on that. I mean, is that a concern for you, that maybe LSU, not only did they lose a lot of guys, but they lost guys that had more value than people are necessarily appreciating?
It's a concern because this is something that we hold as kind of a truism, and we have for years, and we're nothing if not consistent. We kind of like to see top-level teams not rake in the draft unless they're known, like in Alabama or recently in Ohio State, unless they're proven that they can just reload. And even Alabama, we've seen some years where they have a draft that hits them particularly hard in a specific area, a specific unit, and they pay for it the next year. I like, for Michigan, if I'm Michigan, I kind of like that they didn't have a ton of guys, go early. The number of people that just came off the board for LSU, it's great. It's a great recruiting, thing you can point to, and you can show how much money these checks are going for and how many guys are drafting. That's great for building the next 4 years. It's not great for this year. So that concerns me a little bit. On the heels of that, I want to wrap this up, and I want to do something a little different. We're not picking, playoffs, national championships, that sort of thing. I want to do this. I'm going to give you my floor and ceiling and pick for LSU this year, and I think I'd like for you to do the same. So for me, I think their floor, a fair floor, is 8-4. I don't think they'll get there, but I think partially the schedule's brutal. I don't. If they played Texas in week 4 and Ole Miss in week 2, I'd like that a little bit more. They very well could be a better team than Texas at the end of the year, but not be able to show it because they play them in the second week of the season. I think their floor is 8-4. I think their ceiling, and LSU fans are going to kill me for this, I think their ceiling's 10-2. I really do, where I do think a lot of the unknowns are going to prove to be positives. And some of this is the guys that you just listed that you're worried because they've been backup players before, they're not going to start. Some of these players, they're going to get leapfrogged by younger guys that we don't know yet. We said the same thing for Ohio State. So in that regard, I don't think all the unknowns are bad or scary. But I do think there's enough unknowns there that pure math says that some of those positions just aren't going to be what they were last year. And LSU had some close games last year. So 10-2 right now, I'm not loving that Texas game. So that's just one more drop game throughout the year would be their ceiling. For me, I've got 9-3, losing to an Alabama or Auburn, losing to Texas, and then maybe losing another one down the stretch. Give me your floor, ceiling, and actual prediction for the year.
I think I agree with you on both counts. I think LSU's realistic floor is 8-4, and the realistic ceiling's 10-2. They're the most volatile team, I will say, probably in the national landscape. It won't shock me if I'm completely wrong. If they end up being 12-0 or 11-1, it wouldn't shock me. If they ended up being 7-5, it wouldn't shock me. I think it's hard for them to go 6-6. There's just not that many losable games, or shouldn't be. But like you said, you get Texas. To my mind, it's Texas, it's Florida, it's Alabama, and if you want to call half and half, Auburn and A&M, kind of the combination of those two back and back. There's like 4 kind of losable games there, or 4 very difficult games. If you split them, you end up at 10-2. If you want to say 5 losable games, what have you. You got to win 3 out of 5 to get to 10-2. I think the Texas game is a really tough spot, so that's a high probability of a loss. I think Alabama's in a better position this year than LSU. They just are. Partly due to Texas and Alabama, there's something very much in common as a problem for LSU. They both had so many guys hurt last year that they've brought back more than they should have. They're going to reload. They don't have to reload as much. They're just going to get healthy. And they got guys like Dylan Moses or, Stearns at Texas that are just going to come back this year that you probably wouldn't be playing normally this season. First team All-American caliber players. That, I think, kind of makes me think they're probably going to drop those 2 games. And even if they manage to win one, you've still got really 3 other losable games in my mind. And you still might lose one of those. And the chances are high enough that I think you probably look at a 10-2 realistic ceiling. On the other hand, it's entirely possible in my mind that you drop Texas, you drop Florida, you drop Alabama, and then you, at the brutal end of the season with Auburn and A&M, I've been realistic about this in the past. It's hard for any team, if your aspiration is national title, if that's the kind of program you are, once you hit 3 losses, it's hard to keep focus and not drop a 4th if you've got tough games at the end of the season, like Auburn or A&M. Just because your team is not going to have the same intensity, your goals are going to be off the board in the last 2 weeks of the year, and that makes those 2 games actually, in my mind, a lot more brutal than they normally would be because of where they placed. So, yeah, I mean, I would say 2 to 4 losses. 3 losses to me is realistic. If you had to pin me down, I would say 9-3 regular season. It's not a bad thing, and you have to be realistic that when you're coming off a national championship, you're going to have a little bit of a rebuilding year. And when you're rebuilding, as a straight fact, LSU is rebuilding with more talent lost than any national champion in the last 20 years from what I researched, and just in terms of total number of draft picks. There's going to be a step back. And LSU easily could rebound the next year. They could surprise me this year. We still have no idea what the coordinators are going to look like. We haven't even touched on Pelini, which I don't think anybody fully knows. I think he'll simplify things, which will help with new players. I'm really concerned about the offensive coordinator. If they step back to where they were before they had Brady, or if Ensminger is able to finally absorb that, because people say what they want. Brady was the play caller. There are so many unknowns. Maybe this year is a bit of a rough year, but this program is just continuing to build, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, and to that point, I got an Alabama friend of mine that I was asking about. It was a couple years ago. I was like, what's going to happen this year? What if Alabama's not that good this year? And he was like, I don't really care. We got the hardware. This was a year after the national. I think it might have been 2018. He's like, we got the hardware. So whatever we get this year is gravy. If we have a decent year, it's fine. We're this close removed from a national championship trophy that we can go point to. So we don't really we're not upset if we go, 10-2, 9-3, whatever. So I think that's the mentality that LSU fans are going to have, and they know that there's probably more hardware on the horizon given how they're recruiting. So they're probably not too worried about our floor and ceiling predictions for this year. All right, y'all, that is it for LSU. Let us know in the comments what you think LSU is going to do this year, and let us know if we're crazy. Give us a floor and ceiling as well, not just your pick, and that'll let us know that you made it to the end of the video. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.